Just for one video, let's talk about just for one day. Okay, how am I going to do this intro without making people feel old? Oh no, okay, I'm just going to give you a big sorry right now because I'm going to make y'all feel old. Live Aid happened in 1985. Now, this is not a brag, but I am young. I was not born when Live Aid happened. I was not born for like another 17 years. So going into the Live Aid musical, I don't hold as much nostalgia as some other people for this event. However, I feel like the actual moment of Live Aid, this story, has rippled down through the generations. Even though it happened 17 years prior to me being, you know, in existence, the impact of the single from Band-Aid and this absolutely massive concert happening in two different places in the world simultaneously has lasted the test of time. So, as someone who is a bit more of an outsider to Live Aid, what did I think of this musical? Did it live up to all of the expectations I have based on what I've heard about Live Aid? Or do I feel a bit too disconnected to really relate to it? Let's find out. But if you haven't seen my face before, hi, I'm Elliot. I talk about theatre. I am the most chaotic theatre person on the internet, and that is a hard ask. I do reviews, I do discussions, I do video essays, and if any of that sounds interesting to you, please consider hitting like and subscribe. It really helps me, it helps out the channel. But let's talk about the Live Aid musical, Just for One Day. It has basically two titles, and that they just pick one. Pick one. Just be the Live Aid musical. It's fine. Before I went into this show, the one thing I knew about it was what my friend Ashley had said about it prior, which was it's a little bit like a British Come From Away, which obviously I heard that and went, yes! Because if you don't know, Come From Away is my favourite musical. The things I love about Come From Away is how it takes this perspective, tells you all of these different stories, kind of makes this scale out of such a small cast. There's so much about Come From Away and its style that really works, and I can completely see the comparison that my friend was making. However, I think there's something that Come From Away does that this show is missing, which I'll talk about as I dive in. As I said, I wasn't alive when Band-Aid happened, but I don't think that is necessarily a detriment. Because, as we have proved from shows like Come From Away, I don't necessarily have to have a memory or an attachment to the situation, whether that be a positive or a negative thing, to really find myself attached to the message of a show. And I agree that that is the sense for Just for One Day. I don't feel my lack of nostalgia for Band-Aid hinders my enjoyment of this show at all. But there is one thing that I feel like Come From Away does that this show doesn't, and that is the much wider perspective on the event that each show tackles. No matter what some people may say, Come From Away is through and through a ensemble show. Every single character in that show gets so much to multi-role, so much to do. Even the characters we have more focus on don't really feel like they're taking the bulk of the show. Whereas this musical decides to focus mainly on two perspectives. The first being the organizer of the event, Bob Geldof, and one perspective from the fans. This being a woman called Suzanne. And because of that, I'm not sure how much this show necessarily manages to create that sense of community. I feel like from the start of this show, it's kind of building towards being more of an ensemble piece. Which in parts it is. But like the opening number, we're introduced to people name by name who stand up and say where they were during Live Aid. Some of them were at the event, some of them were watching from afar, and we get to get a sense of their stories. And then we don't really touch on them ever again. They get like another line towards the end, and that's about it. I feel like it's a bit of a shame that it doesn't really widen itself out beyond the two stories that it's telling. And because of that, you don't really get the scale of how big Live Aid actually was. There were hundreds and hundreds, thousands and thousands of people in that arena on that day in Wembley Stadium. There were people across the globe watching. With that said, I do enjoy the stories that this show decides to tell. Bob Geldof is a great protagonist. You really get a sense of why he does this. You get a great sense of his worldview, how he's kind of moved by this plead on TV about the famine in Ethiopia. Despite being very closed off and swearing every 5 minutes and having that very harsh exterior, you really do get a sense of the human and the person within. And the contrast of his attitude towards what he's actually doing and the good that he really wants to put out. His shutting down of the hero worship is really lovely to see. And all the conflicts that he has are so engaging. Especially his ones with his fellow people putting on the event, how his demands are a little bit too much, his arguments with Maggie Thatcher, and his anger at her tax policies. There's so much here that the musical dives into that's really, really good. And I also enjoyed the perspective of Suzanne, an everyday person that really delivers the balance between, someone like Geldof, someone who is famous, someone who is kind of in the limelight and worshipped a little bit, to just a normal everyday person who wants to put out a little bit of good into the world. They decide to split her perspective off into two characters. An older version of Suzanne reflecting on a younger version of Suzanne, which makes it a little bit weird that no one else in this musical is split in this way, but that's a little bit more nitpicky. You really do manage to fall in love with her perspective, the relationship that she's trying to build with her crush, and the thrill and the joy of managing to be there at Live Aid. It adds another dynamic to the show that really, really works, alongside the contrast of Gemma, someone who wasn't born during Live Aid. Obviously, from what I've said, this is clearly the perspective that I attach to the most. I feel this is a very smart way of balancing this, making sure that while this is definitely a celebration of the nostalgia of this moment in history, also making it feel accessible to people who weren't there. I do think a little bit of her section does fall into the trap of just being "oh no, I'm old" jokes. Some of these working, some of them falling a little bit more flat for me. Maybe it's just because I'm young. There's a one-off joke that kind of annoyed me a little bit. And yes, I know it's a one-off joke. It doesn't really matter. But they seem to infer that the 80s is being taught in history. No, it isn't. The furthest I ever went in history was like 1940. Is that just me? Is that just my school? Did anyone learn about Band-Aid in school? Surely not. These are the main perspectives that are told through this show. And I say main, even though Gemma even still feels like a bit of a third wheel to it. These perspectives work for the most part, but it still feels a little bit limited. I wish there was more room in the story to tell about the other people that we see. The show doesn't really have the time to focus on these little stories that we see, and there's so few of them, and they come up so little, that you kind of wonder what's the point of having them in there at all. But I think the biggest flaw, the biggest perspective that we're really missing is the Ethiopian perspective. As this musical is determined to show you and to prove, Band-Aid was always meant to be just like a one and done thing. It was meant to be like a little patch, a Band-Aid, a plaster of sorts. A one and done thing to help out, but it's never meant to be the ending. The show does a very good job at exploring this and showing how different generations can step up. This is done really well for the character of Gemma, pushing forward for younger generations to fight for different causes. The causes of which, obviously, we can kind of attach these ourselves, but the show doesn't actually provide any examples of modern day struggles, which I think leaves it nicely open to any modern conflict or bits of war or civil rights. But I think it's a big shame that the only Ethiopian perspective we get in this show is still someone who is British. We get little bits and pieces of a story of someone who's working in Ethiopia, trying to help over there during the famine. She's British and she is constantly reflecting back at home. She levies some criticism towards stuff like Band-Aid and eventually softens on the idea and realizes the good that it can provide. And some of the most powerful moments in this show is when Geldorf actually goes over there, witnessing the effects of the famine firsthand, seeing the tragedy and the death and the pain that this brings. I feel like there is probably room for the show to have a little bit more of this. Because at the end of the day, there is so much nostalgia for the actual music acts at Band-Aid. There's a lot of nostalgia about that. But at the end of the day, what Live Aid and Band-Aid were really about were this famine, this absolutely tragic event in human history that they were trying to help. And I feel like spending a little bit more time on this and really making that the bigger thing to reflect on rather than the actual event happening would have made the show's themes a little bit stronger. On the whole, I think the way that they tackle Just One Day is strong. I like a lot of the ideas here. I just feel like there could be a slight adjustment of focus. Something I have unanimous praise for is how this music is integrated into the show, though. This is a jukebox musical. We've seen jukebox musicals before tell the story of the artists. Tina, Ain't Too Proud, Beautiful. You can name many and many examples. However, this one decides to tell the story of Live Aid through the music of the artists who performed on the initial track and at the 2 concerts. This is some of the greatest music of all time, and honestly, I'm realizing now how much my non-musical theatre music taste is very 80s. Heroes, Message in a Bottle, We Will Rock You, I'm Still Standing, Bohemian Rhapsody, Let It Be. This show is filled to the brim of some of the greatest music ever written, and integrated so cleverly into the plot, underlining certain moments within the show, especially during Act 1, and then being used as part of the concert, flowing really well between different acts for Act 2. This relates, but I'm kind of moving on a little bit towards like the staging of the show. I really enjoy the fact that we don't actually get people specifically cast as acts like Freddie Mercury, David Bowie. There's a real fluidity between this ensemble of who gets to play these roles. For example, using Queen and Freddie Mercury as the example, we get Ollie Dobson's character doing We Will Rock You, but then later in the show, it's Freddie Love who gets to play Freddie Mercury doing Bohemian Rhapsody. There's not one set person playing these roles. There's nothing that really changes between these people playing these roles. They're not cosplaying these artists, and because of that, they really get to put their own spin and perspective and different versions onto these really, really iconic songs, alongside some absolutely gorgeous choreography and the really clever decision to use cameras. These hidden cameras at the sides of the stage and in the boxes at the Old Vic, allowing for the back wall of projection to have the actors on it, very much like you would see at a concert. The design of this show is honestly great. It's fairly simple, with just this projection wall that's kind of on 3 walls. That's the best way to describe it. Imagine this is the stage, and there's projection here, there's projection on each side, and then there's the main stage. I'm sure I'll put a photo up, because that will explain it better. And then there's this tiered platforms, this almost like seating arrangement that pushes forward and backwards. It's very slick, it's very malleable, and works very well for what this show is trying to go for. And finally, let's talk a little bit about this cast. Craig Ells as Bob Geldorf is fantastic. He's fiery, he's unmovable. You really get this layered sense of who he is, from his reactions to his stance to the actual script, which performed extremely well by Els. I really enjoy the fact that he doesn't actually get much singing through the show until his big moment at the actual concert, which Craig performs with such passion and power behind it. Jackie Clune and Hope Kenner play both the older and younger versions of Suzanne respectively. I love the dynamic that they each have, this kind of reflection of each other. Clune comes off as a really kind and loving person, really taking Gemma under her wing, and the 2 actresses really working hand in hand to deliver this different perspective from Live Aid. Naomi Catio as Gemma, she immediately delivers this very different energy to the rest of the cast, this kind kind of youthful energy about her, that determination, and honestly, her performance of Our Generation is one of the key highlights of the entire show. This ensemble is phenomenally talented as well. There's so many great names that I can pull out. Joel Montague gets a great role as Harvey, coming in Act 2 and being a nice foil to Bob Geldof. You have Danielle Steers, who's absolutely fantastic in her role. Another great source of conflict. Joe Foster's fantastic. Ollie Dobson performs the hell out of We Will Rock You. But there are two names in this ensemble that I do want to pull out and spend a little bit more time on. And they are Abby Enna Oumyua, who delivers such a heartfelt and really fleshed out performance as the worker in Ethiopia, and being great at providing that critical voice, especially in the early moments of this show. And Julie Atherton, who plays Maggie Thatcher, who just understands the absolute distaste that this audience had for Maggie. My favorite little moment that she has is obviously when Margaret Thatcher comes out, any sane audience member is going to boo her. And it's almost like Julie Atherton just encourages this. She comes out, she hears the boo, and she just goes, yes, right, correct. Genius. So funny. So hilarious. Gets the mannerism sound to a T and makes it so wonderfully over the top. When I reflect on Just One Day, I have my criticisms here and there, but on the whole, I do think this is quite a successful piece of theatre. It retells Live Aid with a lot of the nostalgia that is key to what made Live Aid such an important event, while also not shying away from talking about the impact on future generations and the main goal of what Live Aid was. As I said, I think there are moments in this show where it feels like its focus isn't clear enough to make sure that this show is kind of diving into the different elements that it needs to, how big this event actually was, and the other side of it, the thing that it was trying to help. But it is a fantastic celebration of the legacy of this event. But what do you think? Have you seen Just for One Day? Let me know all of your thoughts in the comments down below. If you did enjoy this video, please consider hitting like and subscribe. It really helps me out, helps out the channel. Here's some links to my videos on screen right now, and a link to my Instagram, which drop me a follow over there. But that's it for me today, and I hope to see you next time. Bye!